There are three things that are going on now, to great extremes that have not existed since the 1930 to 45 period. It affects everybody, and so I started studying in history, and it's important to know those three things and then to understand them well.
Ray Dalio is one of the greatest economic geniuses of all time. He is the founder of Bridgewater, one of the world's most prestigious hedge funds. He provides unique insight into the inner workings of the economy and the stock market. He recently caught my attention when he started talking about what he calls massive wealth transfers. Today, I'm going to share with you a recent speech he gave, and we'll discuss whether he's right or wrong. I ask you to watch the video to the end and share your views with us.
The first is what is going on with money and credit when you get to something like a zero interest rate and you need buying power. The government needs buying power, but they can't tax it. So what we have is the production of a lot of debt that the central bank prints money and buys that debt to spend. And the last time that happened, in the last few years, it happened starting in 2008. Interest rates hit zero. They couldn't lower their interest rates. So they had to print a lot of debt, and the government went in and bought it. Okay. And we're coming to the end of a debt cycle. So this is a big thing, because where does the money come from and who will get what? The government will now determine that, and then they'll print it and it'll devalue money. Okay. This is, and how money flows, a big deal. So that's number one. The second one are wealth and political gaps that are causing great conflicts. Throughout history, there's always been the main things that everybody's always fought over is money and power, particularly political power. So what we have is a situation when you have a large wealth gap and you have an economic downturn, particularly if you put a lot of debt having at the same time, you have a fight. I mean, that's been true through history. And it's reflected in the political gap. So the political gap it's classic political gap. Left, right, capitalist, socialist. Well, how do you distribute? How are you going to deal with that? That becomes the other. And how you fight. So that's the second of the two, this wealth political gap that's causing the conflict. And it's coming at a time where we don't have much money because we don't have a good financial position. We're printing and putting it out with made up money, meaning what happened, like COVID was such a good example. A lot of people and companies had falls in their income that would be ruinous. If checks didn't go out, we would have had a revolution. And so those checks and how do you save everything and so on. Okay, so, and it's not like the government had real money. So they paid more debt and then the Federal Reserve printed it, the checks went out, which diminishes the value of money and so on and changes things.
Ray Dalio brings up three profound issues that are reshaping our world, and it's crucial to understand their full scope. First, regarding money and credit, we're facing a situation where traditional tools like lowering interest rates are no longer enough. When rates hit zero, governments can't simply tax more to boost buying power, so they turn to printing money. This has happened before, most notably after the 2008 crisis and again during COVID. The result is a flood of new debt bought by central banks. In the short term, this props up the economy, but in the long term, it erodes the value of money. It's a classic end-of-cycle event, where the system can no longer sustain itself without drastic measures. Dalio's second point, the wealth and political gaps, is perhaps even more alarming. Throughout history, when large wealth inequalities intersect with political divides, it often leads to unrest. Think of the French Revolution or the social movements of the 20th century. In modern times, the gap between the rich and the poor has widened dramatically. During the pandemic, government-issued stimulus checks kept things from collapsing, but this was done by printing money the government didn't really have, which only increased debt. The distribution of wealth has become a political battleground, with one side pushing for more socialist policies, while the other clings to capitalism. Statistics back this up. The top 1% in the U.S. controls more wealth than the entire middle class combined, according to data from the Federal Reserve. This disparity isn't just an economic issue, it's a social crisis waiting to explode. As Dalio points out, when wealth gaps widen and political divides deepen, history tells us conflict is inevitable.
So then the third thing is the rise of a great power to challenge an existing great power. So the rise of China to challenge the United States. In all history, there are world orders. What that means are the dominant power. It's like in nature almost, the big bull or something. Anyway, there's the dominant power. And then what happens is, in 1945, we entered the American world order. The United States won the war, and then in 1945, the winners of the world carved up the world. We had 80% of what was considered money at the time, gold, 80% of the world's money, essentially. We counted for half the world's economy, and the rules were set in the United States, basically. That's why the United Nations is in New York, the World Bank and the IMF are in Washington, D.C., because we began the American century. And then we are now at a time, we never had another power challenge us in the same way. There was the Soviet Union, but they were always a fraction of the size economically, so couldn't compete on that same basis. They had nuclear weapons, but they didn't have the economic power and so on. But now we're dealing with China coming on as a power. I spent a lot of time in China over the last 36 years, by the way, and I admire how they're doing a lot of things. I mean, I know it's controversial to say that, but in terms of they're a power. Whoa, since I started going there, their average income has increased by 30 times. So they're a comparable power, and they're also growing faster. And so that has an effect. So those three things are things that never happened in my lifetime before, but happened before in history, which led me to do the studies of what happened in history and the lessons I could gain. It affects everybody, it affects, we know, let's start with ourselves. Most importantly, forget about the outside thing. Can we be healthy and strong? And what do we need to do? To know you have to be in it together. If we can row in the same direction, okay? If we can have thoughtful disagreement and get past that, if we can be in it together, like the wealthy and the poor. It sounds so difficult, but at the same time, if you read history and you see what happens when it's not, when you have a civil war, we could be on the brink of a civil war. That sounds so crazy, but the truth is, in most countries, almost every century, there was a civil war or a revolution, some form of civil war or revolution. So it's almost inevitable that we're going to have something, okay? You either resolve it or you start fighting so badly that you really, once you cross a certain line, there's no coming back, because you do the damage, you demonize, and that person's such an enemy, or that class of people is such an enemy that the communication's gone and the fight. Well, you see this in politics today. In other words, is there a respect for the system and a mutual respect of trying to resolve these types of things? Or will they go to any lengths to win? Because a constitution or law will only carry you to so far, okay? There has to be an element of respect for it, right?
Ray Dalio's insight into the global power shift between the U.S. and China draws on centuries of historical patterns, and it's an unsettling one. Historically, when a rising power challenges an existing dominant force, it often leads to conflict. The Thucydides trap, a concept coined by historian Graham Allison, highlights that in 12 out of 16 historical cases where a rising power challenged a ruling one, war was the outcome. With China growing economically at a rapid pace, 30 times since Dalio first visited, this power shift could redefine the geopolitical landscape. What's different this time is the scale. China is not just an economic competitor, it's reshaping technology, infrastructure, and global trade at unprecedented speeds. The Belt and Road Initiative, for example, is connecting countries across Asia, Africa, and Europe, creating economic dependencies that could shift global influence in Beijing's favor. The U.S., while still a powerhouse, now faces a rival of comparable size and, in many areas, superior growth. The Soviet Union never had this kind of economic clout, making China a much more formidable competitor. However, the most alarming part of Dalio's message isn't just the rise of China, it's the internal instability brewing in the U.S. The increasing polarization between political and economic classes is reaching a boiling point. We've seen that civil wars and revolutions are not unique to history, they are cyclical. According to the Center for Systemic Peace, 75% of all nations have experienced some form of civil conflict in the last century. In the U.S., political discourse has become so fractured that constructive dialogue is rare. Dalio's warning about the brink of a civil war may seem extreme, but given the rise in domestic unrest, protests, and even violent incidents over the past few years, it's not far-fetched. The bigger question, however, is how the U.S. will navigate these internal and external pressures simultaneously.
If you think about, I want to distinguish, there's big differences in opportunities. So let's say, supposing you have two people of comparable opportunities, the marshmallow test is you take a kid and you say, okay, you can have one marshmallow now, or you could have two marshmallows in 15 minutes if you don't eat the first one. Once you start to realize that deferred gratification is going to make you better and so on, and you start to count how many days, weeks, months, or years can I live if I don't have money come in, and you start to focus in on that, that's the first step. Okay, like the marshmallow test. So I want to save. You got to start there. Then if you do that, you're necessarily going to go save in what? And then you'll start to get exposure, how these things are different. Okay, then you start to care. Once you have one of these and one of those, and you start to experience, and then you start to learn. And basically that's what makes the difference. When it comes to the money, now, at that moment that you don't want it, you have savings. That means I want savings. So the next thing inevitably that's going to come at you is, where do I put it? And then you get your choices, and then you experience it and you learn. I think first, calculate how many days, weeks, months, or years you can live on your saving. Because when you do that, you'll gain security. So look at how much you're spending and then say, how much do I need? And whatever that number is, you're going to need more than that because it may go down rather than go up. So now, do I have a year spending? I think you start there. Then you start to think, what are the things that are most important for me? And then you start with your business or your residence that have a symbiotic relationship and that you know well. If you start with your business, okay, you're closer to that, investing in yourself, whatever that may end up being, that may be your best investment. But if you're in a job, that's not the thing because you're in a different position. And then I really think there's something good about your home, a basic thing about your home, because it's nice forced savings. And it also means that you fix it up. You're saving, you find out there's, oh, well, if I add this thing or that thing, and you're enjoying it. So when you're enjoying it and you're controlling it and it's yours and so on, that's pretty good. You know, if they keep mortgage tax deductions and so on, you know, there might be some benefits to it also, okay? But that's not a black and white answer. You know, so you could take a sharp pencil and say, is it better to rent or buy? Okay, that's a different question. But by and large, am I going to move? You know, all of those other questions. So when you start with, okay, what is it that's close to home and how much? You need a certain amount that's liquid. In other words, you got it in your house, you got to make a mortgage payment or something, and all of a sudden, you know, it's not liquid and you lose your job. Well, that can cause you trouble. So how much do I have that's liquid? How much do I have that's not liquid? Okay, and you start to get those things right. Pretty soon, you're getting yourself in good shape. And then you're also having some experiences, and then you go beyond that.
What Ray Dalio touches on here goes beyond financial planning. It's about reshaping how we think about security and growth. It all begins with the marshmallow test, a simple analogy that reveals a profound truth. Success often comes down to deferred gratification. Think about it, not just in finance, but in life. The ability to wait, to build, and to plan carefully separates those who thrive from those who struggle. It's the same reason we see long-term investors like Warren Buffett prosper, while short-term speculators get burned. Let's talk about that safety net he mentions. How many days, weeks, months, or years can you survive on what you've saved? This question forces you to confront the reality of your financial health. Most Americans, according to a report by Bankrate, wouldn't be able to cover an unexpected $1,000 emergency with their savings. This is the modern version of living paycheck to paycheck, a cycle that keeps people locked in financial stress. Dalio's advice is a wake-up call. Build that cushion because it's not just about having money. It's about buying yourself time and options. Dalio emphasizes investing in yourself and your surroundings. Owning a home, for instance, can serve as a form of forced savings. You're not just paying for shelter, you're creating value over time. Studies by the Urban Institute show that homeowners have, on average, 44 times more net worth than renters. It's a long game, but one that pays off when done wisely. And that ties into Dalio's point. What's close to home is where you have the most control. Your business, your home, your skills. These are the things you should focus on before venturing into riskier investments. But it's not just about homes or savings. It's about balance. You need liquidity, Dalio says, which means you need assets you can quickly turn into cash if life throws a curveball. Liquidity is the shield against life's uncertainties, whether it's losing your job or facing an unexpected expense. What Dalio leaves us with is this: it's not about getting rich fast, it's about preparing for the long haul, learning from every experience, and making smart, deliberate moves. And that's the real takeaway for everyone watching. Security isn't just a number in a bank account, it's a mindset, a strategy, and a lifelong journey.